All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining our InoRx webinar, How India Can Accelerate U.S. Clinical Trials, Reducing Timelines Without Compromising Quality. We're really excited to welcome our global audience as we discuss how collaboration, agility, and strong healthcare infrastructure can accelerate clinical development while maintaining the highest standards of quality and patient care. For those new to InoRx and the first time hearing about us, we are a next generation CRO built from the site outward, focused on access, agility, and accountability. We partner across the healthcare ecosystem to deliver high quality, efficient global clinical trials and help sponsors move studies forward faster without compromising scientific rigor, compliance, or execution quality. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to share with you a quick video about who we are and the InoRx difference.
Clinical research has long promised hope to patients. Yet for many sponsors, the path from protocol to patient has become slower, more complex, and increasingly disconnected from real care. InoRx was not born in a boardroom. It was built from inside healthcare. Backed by the SRM Group, we saw where the system was falling short. India, home to extraordinary clinicians, investigators, and patients, has historically been underrepresented in global clinical research. We believe that needed to change. We built a next-generation CRO to increase sponsor value while expanding access for underserved patients. Led in the United States, with clinical execution embedded within India's healthcare system, delivering white glove service to sponsors and offering patients access to a higher standard of care than they might otherwise receive. For sponsors, this means faster startup, predictable execution, and regulatory-ready data. For patients, it means access, care, and hope. At InoRx, clinical trials aren't transactions. They're commitments. InoRx, simplifying trials, accelerating cures.
Thank you. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Shweta Shah from AstraZeneca, along with our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Melvin George. Dr. Melvin George is a clinical pharmacologist and research leader with extensive experience in global clinical trials and investigator-led research. He serves as a nodal officer at the SRM ICMR Center for Clinical Trials and has participated as an investigator in over 65 clinical trials. He has authored more than 145 publications and actively contributes to the clinical research community. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Melvin. I'll hand it over to you to introduce Dr. Shweta.
Thank you, Alisa. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, everyone. So the topic that we're going to discuss today is on how India can accelerate clinical trials. We all know that when it comes to drug discovery, a lot of companies which are involved in drug discovery are based in the US and Western Europe. And many times clinical trials are begun in with these new molecules. And we see that from the literature that there are some of these clinical trials which start in a big way, but at some point they encounter challenges. And one of the major challenges to clinical trials is the recruitment issues. Sometimes trials get terminated because the sponsor is not able to get sufficient number of patients from the different sites. And many times trials get prolonged for more than what is anticipated. And as a result of that overshoots the budget and the entire drug discovery, drug development pipeline, everything goes for, there are a lot of challenges that the sponsors face when it comes to actually completing the trial. And so today evening, we're going to see how India as a country is an excellent destination to carry out clinical trials. Although the reports suggest that almost 2 to 3% of clinical trials worldwide happen in India, we're also seeing that in the last few years, with the change in regulations, there has been a significant surge in the number of trials that are done in India. And this evening, we're going to see what are those positive aspects that are exactly happening in India that makes India a preferred destination for doing clinical trials. And for that, we have Dr. Shweta Shah with us from AstraZeneca. Dr. Shweta is a medical affairs manager She primarily works in the field of breast oncology at AstraZeneca. She has over 6 years of experience in medical affairs, clinical research, and scientific engagement. She has led pre-launch strategies, supported global and local clinical trials, and contributed to protocol development and safety monitoring across oncology programs. Dr. Shah also brings deep expertise in cross-functional collaboration, regulatory compliance, and medical strategy with a strong focus on bridging science and clinical execution. She has worked closely with several global stakeholders, KOLs, and investigator networks, and has been actively involved in advancing clinical research and evidence generation. And I'm also happy to say that she's also part of the P2PC network, which together with SRM and P2PC, we are doing an excellent course in CPD for training the next generation of pharmaceutical leaders. So thank you, Dr. Shweta, for in accepting our invitation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melvin. And it's been an honor and privilege to be invited by the InoRx team. And thank you, Dr. Melvin, and the entire team for giving me this opportunity to present to the audience today. So with that, I'll just quickly share my screen. And please to confirm once my screen is visible. I just put that on slideshow.
Yes, it's visible, Shweta.
Okay, perfect. So, good evening and good morning to everybody who's joined across the globe for this particular webinar. So, it was quite an interesting topic which has been taken up, and it's really heartwarming to see that India is now emerging as a very important center across the globe for running clinical trials. And this is my part where I'll briefly cover about how uh, you know it, it's really reducing the timelines, and there is no compromise on the quality of patients which are getting enrolled into the study. Before I begin my presentation, just a couple of disclosures that this presentation is only for educational purposes, and it only reflects my personal views, and it is not related to my organization, that is AstraZeneca, and I do not have any conflict of interest. With that, just to give you a brief introduction, we know that India is really emerging as a strategic hub for high quality, diverse, and globally relevant clinical trials. And this has happened so in the last decade because the kind of population which is there in India, it's almost exceeding 1.4 billion. And if you see now the kind of disease evolution which is happening is really mirroring the global health challenges which are there. And this is why this becomes an important opportunity for drug development as well. Now, in the last 2 decades per se, India not only has witnessed an increase in the lifestyle disorders and non-communicable disorders along with the infectious diseases, and more so cancer, which is the leading health burden. The country provides both a volume as well as diversity for these kind of patients, which helps us to conduct clinical trials in this set of patients as well. And uh, what has really changed is in the past, the kind of population which lived in India, it did not have those kind of lifestyles which we try now are trying to acquire from the Western population. And hence, as a result of this, when we see that the kind of diseases which are happening, there is a lot of cross pollination which is happening. There are people migrating from different parts of the world to India, and from India they're moving abroad, which is why you see that the increase in the diseases which are happening is quite similar to the Western culture. Now, why do multi-regional clinical trials really become important? Now, the global regulators, we know that the US FDA as well as the EMA, they are expecting data which is being generated from these clinical trials to be representative of the population at large across globally. And also, as outlined in the ICHE 17, maintaining this regional balance is very important for a trial to become globally acceptable. Now, another important aspect is that what regulators feel is that when you conduct a clinical trial only focusing on a certain patient population, you are creating a protocol only for that group. Now, if you want that molecule or that therapy to be available in other countries, because of the good and strong regulatory framework which is laid down across, they need to have a separate specific trial in that country as well. As a result, the cost increases, and hence it really gets important that all the clinical trials happen under the same protocol and not separate protocols. And hence India has re-emerged as a strategic geography because it offers access, disease diversity, as well as the trial capability is also increasing. And just to give you some perspective from my organization as well. So when I joined back in the early, almost 6, 7 years ago, at that point of time, we saw that the kind of regulatory framework which was there, we didn't have so much of population which had different kinds of diseases. And because I'm working in the field of oncology, probably I could give you an example from oncology itself, that because the disease was per se very rare in India, a phase 3 trial which was conducted with global population was considered acceptable to be replicated, or was acceptable for Indian population, and there was a waiver given for a local phase 3, and but a mandatory safety phase 4 which was given. But now we see that increasingly, because the disease burden has increased so much and the kind of heterogeneous population which we see in India, as a result, because there is a high volume of disease of all what is getting evaluated globally, that is why the Indian regulators are also now expecting that these set of patients should be included and into the global clinical trials. Now, where did this need gap really start off from? Right. So, in the beginning, when especially for the US markets, when these began drug development process, the cost for the developing an entire molecule was more than 2 billion per drug. And if you see the timeline, right, because they had a very limited patient population, let's say from the Western population, that is from the United States or even from the European Union, the recruitment process was happening really slow. As a result, because the patent runways were getting short, because the patent pathways were burning out, because the recruitment process was very slow. And ultimately, by the time you complete the entire clinical trial and actually bring it into the country for marketing authorization, there is barely 4 to 5 years when the patient are able to really benefit from the innovative therapy. This, along with the inability to power the studies because of the saturated US and European sites, it really became important to ensure that we have certain countries being a part of these clinical trials where they could not just reduce this timeline but also include a heterogeneous patient population. And that's where they started identifying India as a key center. Now, as of today, India's position in the global clinical hub is at number 3 as per 2024 data. And if we see across, there is almost 15% of global clinical trials taking place in India. The second important aspect is prospective registration of trials is a mandate in India since the year 2000. And if you see, there are over 90,000 clinical trials with 54% revenue share, majorly for the phase 3 clinical trials. Last but not the least, because the patient population is so huge, we have a patient population of 1. The population of the country is so huge. As a result, this patient population is treatment naive because they have not received different kinds of therapies. And because they are treatment naive, they stand as a good base to be included into these clinical trials because the baseline values are very, so the patient recruitment is very easy. Last but not the least, even at the government level, the government is trying and ensuring that there is a lot of digitization of data, the healthcare system, the entire infrastructure, everything is into the digital platform. And there are various ways where you can actually access hospitals, centers of academic importance, have healthcare registries as a part of the database, as well as electronic data sets. Now, let's start talking about why are pharmaceutical companies per se really considering India. First, like I mentioned, there is a large and diverse patient population. And just to give you an example, when when I joined into the medical affairs team, we were receiving a lot of queries from our global counterparts whether they could consider India as a center. What we from the medical affairs team really did is try to reach out to our healthcare professionals and ask them, what are the kind of patients coming into their centers and the hospitals as well as their clinics. And we took that data back to our global team to tell them that, the kind of patient pool which you're looking for into the global clinical trial is actually here. And that's where that was the first step when they started considering India as a center, because we were able to tell them or inform them that, whatever patient numbers which they needed from this particular region could be easily recruited, right? Secondly, the disease burden in the country had slowly started increasing the last decade. As a result, because of this heterogeneous patient population, which can be definitely validated externally, the patient population became very diverse, which could be included into the trial. And this led to a very strong data set as well as improvement in the recruitment speed. This ultimately led to these patient pool getting included in the trial. And that is why the trial was much more generalizable to the population. Now, today, I can give you the statistics that across all, and I can definitely give you examples of oncology trials, that across all oncology trials, if you see the kind of patient population and ethnicity, it is Caucasians which are higher in number, and second, Asian population is almost half, rather, or three-fourth of the patient population which is recruitment. So across the globe, when trials are conducted, almost half of the patient population is the population from India, or rather the Asian countries. Now, the second important thing became that because of the growing disease burden, there were a lot of diseases which were coming up, and it became important to treat them effectively. Treat them effectively, it was important to understand what kind of newer therapies can be used, because of a lot of resistance being developed, both for communicable as well as for non-communicable, so infectious and non-infectious diseases. As a result, India became much more you know clinical, much more advanced in terms of clinical research, and the kind of investigators which came out of from the academic institutes really helped. Second, the kind of infrastructure which was there in India also improved. So earlier we probably had 4 to 5 premium institutes or high volume centers only in the tier 1 cities, but eventually this expansion started even in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Now, as a result, what happened is, because a large number of doctors who were clustered in these tier 1 cities then started moving to the tier 2 and tier 3 cities because of the well developed infrastructure, as a result, the network kept on growing. Third, it became very important for us as well to partner with research societies, so ICMR and ICSR, for ensuring that they are training all the upcoming clinicians for clinical research. This ultimately led to well developed sites, well developed investigators and clinicians who could be a part of the trial and understand the trial protocol and integrity in detail. Last but very important point was the evolving regulatory framework in the country. So we saw that in probably 2 decades ago, our regulatory framework was not so strong. But now, with the increasing importance of India standing as, in the focus for everything, the regulatory authorities also stepped up, and the entire free they also along with the medical research societies, develop good and better framework. Now, how can India really reduce the timelines, right? And these are a couple of matrices which really tells us that these really help in ensuring that patients are recruited faster. First, if you see, if a patient per patient cost for a phase 3 trial in the other countries is almost 10 to 15 US dollars, in India that would almost be less than half. So that's almost 3,000 to $5,000. So there is almost a 40 to 70% operational cost which is reduced without compromising the standards. Second, there was a very standard benchmark rate which was set for enrollment of patients into the clinical trials. But in India, because we have a large patient pool, the recruitment is much more faster. And this recruitment challenge is, or the enrollment challenge is the biggest source of delay for global clinical trials. So previously, and again, through my journey in the last 6 to 7 years, I have seen that initially the patient numbers which were a part of the global clinical trial were probably 7 to 10. But today, every single trial, a global clinical trial, has more than 50 patients which are included. And of course, this I'm giving you a perspective only from oncology because that's my background. That there are, out of a patient pool of 600, there are almost 50 to 100 patients which are which are included only from India, not even from Asia. So that you can see that the kind of patient numbers are also very high, and because the recruitment happens faster, that's why US markets are also ensuring that the patient numbers given to India are on the higher side. Last but not the least, the cohort inclusion. Now, because the number of patients are very concentrated in the United States, they are also very highly pre-treated, right? Whereas in India, because they do not have access to all these innovative therapies, that's why the patient population is quite heterogeneous. Their baseline is much better, and hence it, from a trial perspective, this really helps. Next important part is, because India gets included into the GCTs early, there is no separate bridging study which is required in future to acquire an approval in India. And last but not the least, like I mentioned, the regulatory reforms have increased, which is why the timelines have also reduced. Now, I'm sure you all must be aware of the regulatory framework in India, but just to give you a brief context, the central licensing authority in India is the CDSCO, which is the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and this has is primarily responsible for reviewing all the clinical trial applications. Now, there is also a set framework, that is the New Drugs and Clinical Trials Rule 2019, which helps to ensure that all the trials are conducted in the right framework. There is a guideline which is set in. Then, because of this, the international the clinical trials, whatever are being conducted, are as per the international standard guidelines, right? And also, this also sets safeguards the patients, as well as their safety is taken care because of NDCT 2019. Last but not the least, CTRI is involved in prospectively registration of trials, which means that the minute a patient is enrolled into a study, the trial has to be registered onto this platform. Now, from a framework and compliance perspective, few aspects which have really helped. So I won't focus on the 30-day working timeline, but if you see, for global clinical trials, the decision framework, that they have to give out a decision within 90 working days. As a result, because of this set framework, we are able to ensure that regulatory approvals are also happening in a timely manner. Then, for those trials where there is no communication which is received, they are deemed approved because of the no communication received within the defined regulatory window. And last but not the least, the NDCT also lays out very strict a mandate for ensuring that there is compensation which is provided, there is medical treatment which is provided to all those patients who are included into a trial. Now, this entire revolution, which started from 2019, where this NDCT, which you leverage the framework of the ICH GCP, and secondly, the global trials which were permitted from the start, there was a very predictable timeline to all the clinical trials. Second, in 2024, there was an entire digitization which happened. So whatever dossiers for clinical trials had to be submitted was submitted on the Sugam portal. Secondly, clinical research organizations also had a very set framework to ensure that they are compliant and conducting clinical trials in the right manner as per the standard guidelines set in. And last but not the least, a recent amendment to the NDCT was made to the 90-day review timeline was reduced to the 45-day review timeline. Secondly, for the low risk studies, They also ensured that there is a prior intimation pathway. So they didn't have to wait for a complete regulatory approval. And this intimation pathway was for the analytical and non-clinical manufacturing related studies which were conducted. Of course, this does not include the high risk molecule evaluation like cytotoxics, biologics, sex hormone evaluation. It excludes all of these. So this set-wise improvement in the regulatory framework has also led to a 67% rise in the global clinical trial approval from 2019 to 2023. Now, how we can, from India, can really help in global clinical trials is because the kind of patient population which is there, the Asian patient population is quite underrepresented. Now, like I mentioned previously, where only 10 or 20% of the patient population in a global clinical trial was from Asian, now it stands at 20 to 40%. So you realize the kind of patient pool which gets included into these global clinical trials is also important. Secondly, the broader regional participation. So there are different ethnic groups in India itself available, as well as the healthcare settings have also improved. So the infrastructure at various sites, academic centers, private centers, public centers, all of these, because of the improvement in the infrastructure, as a result, this has also led to a broader regional participation. Third is the simultaneous or near simultaneous submission. So one thing which I would like to tell you from my experience as well is that previously, whenever a new molecule got approval in the US market, or which was approved by the US FDA, followed by the European Union, it took almost 1 year or 1.5 or maybe even 2 years for the molecule to even initiate a regulatory filing in India. But now we see, because India having the kind of patient population which could be included in the global clinical trials, this has now also again improved. So when a filing in the US market happens, at the same point in time, there is also a filing happening in the Indian market. So immediately after the US FDA approval, even an India approval is obtained, which is why if you see, um, because of the improvement in the regulatory framework as well, this approval timeline has reduced, the submission timeline has also reduced. Last but not the least, a point which I want to make, maybe not relevant today, but in the future, is that India has, and in the budget for this year, a new biopharma Shakti scheme was laid out, and this is like a huge 10,000 crore rupees outlay, which really dedicates only to the scientific review cadre at the CDSU to reduce the approval delays. Now, this part is not really. I don't know if it would directly help the global clinical trials, but indirectly it will definitely help the global clinical trials because the infrastructure will be laid down. There will be electronic data system, the kind of patients which will be, the patient pool will be increased, the access will be increased, which is why I think in future it would become all the more easy to recruit patients from India. But does quality trade off for speed? Definitely not, right? Key aspects which really are important, and one of the challenges for data integrity. So historically, in India per se, there was only manual entry of data or manual data collection at the sites which were happening. Also, the site qualities were not that great. But now, with more more awareness about clinical research, as well as the upliftment of different centers, there is more discussion. More clinicians are proactive towards research. That is why they are much more well aware of the data, as well as there is an electronic data capture system which is present. There is a mandate for the ALCOA plus principles which are set out for good clinical practices, where the data needs to be compliant, clean, legible, complete, in order to be a part of the and this particular ALCOA principles also is acceptable by the FDA as well as the EMA. Second is the site level consistency and governance. So initially, because there were not good clinical practices and there was no uniformity, because like I said in my past slides as well, that in majorly this was focused to the tier one cities and not to the tier two or tier three hospitals. But now, because with this new um, biopharma shakti scheme which will be laid down, and of course because of much more awareness, there will be improved clinical trial sites, there will be much better cleaner data. Tier 2 and 3 tier 3 cities will be much more aware. Another point to note is that in previously, whenever we used to recruit patients into any trial, we would again focus on the high volume centers in the tier one cities. But now we've started to see, and even from our organization as well, we try and ensure that we conduct programs where we are. So one of our programs is where what we do is we partner with one of the premium institutes, academic institute in the country, and what we do is that we train the students for how they can really write a well written protocol, how they can conduct a clinical trial, what are the aspects which are needed, how the what kind of patients can be included. As a result of which, because they are entirely trained on this particular process of the writing the research question, preparing the protocol, ensuring the site is having that kind of aspects for the lab, the testing, the storage conditions, everything, they are well. So even the clinicians are well aware of what is needed to be a to have a protocol, to have a trial, and what are the aspects which are needed. When they are aware, these sites, these clinicians who then go to the tier 2 and tier 3 cities are able to ensure that those kind of processes are there at their centers, and that's why indirectly we are then able to recruit more patients from these centers as well. Last but not the least, because the clinicians are much more well aware, the CROs which are there are well educated, there is a good connect between the pharma sponsors and with the CROs who help in ensuring that the clinicians are well trained, the investigators are well trained, there is a research coordinators available at these centers who are able to explain the patients why is it important to be a part of the trial. And because there is patient centric execution, this ultimately helps in ensuring that the patients are not dropping off but are retained with better quality, right? So, through clear communication and support at the sites, through these well trained CRAs, which this ultimately really helps in ensuring that the enrollment is not affected. So, the dropout rates are also reduced. To further strengthen India as a center, what is really needed? So that we have seen that year on year, the regulatory framework is continuing to improve. And to ensure that this consistently keeps improving is important. Now, and one of the challenges which we also have been facing that in the past, because like I said, we were really getting waivers for phase 3 because there were not many patient pool in India, and that's why India was never a part of the global clinical trials. But now, if any clinical trial which does a global clinical trial, if it does not have Indian patient population as a part of the phase 3, then the study or the trial is rejected. So our Indian regulatory authority has made it a mandate that every global clinical trial is mandatorily supposed to have Indian patient population as a part of the study, and not just Asian. They specifically need Indian patients data. And again, to highlight that this patient population should not just be 1% or 2% of the entire trial population, but it should almost account for 5 to 10%. So, a significant patient population needs to be a part of the global clinical trial to ensure that the drug is approved in the country. And this regulatory well defined regulatory structure and framework also pushed us to inform our global counterparts that every clinical trial should have Indian patient population. So there was a well defined ecosystem which we created to ensure, and we informed our global counterparts that India needs to be a part of every global clinical trial. And then it became like a mandate. We had one clinical trial coming to the country, and year on year, because they saw that the patient recruitment numbers kept on increasing, we had better recruitment with lesser cost. They were very happy to take these patients, to take up India as a site. Then next is ensuring that there are high performing trial sites beyond the metro cities. So like I mentioned, there is an effort to build the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, but I think it should go on from there itself. And digitization and decentralized support models with site capability to ensure that if there is a well trained person, he is able to conduct much more complex studies and even earlier phase studies. So currently we have only phase 3 clinical trials happening in India, which are global clinical trials. But we want to ensure that going forward, because our regulatory framework is so well defined, as well as we have a good electronic data system, we have the site infrastructure and the capability, we also want to ensure that better earlier phase trials are also included. And again, to this, we have initiated a project with our clinicians, where we are trying to develop a committee which can train the young budding doctors on how a trial needs to be conducted, so that indirectly we are uplifting the capability of India as a center. So, just to summarize, the kind of patient pool which is available, we are able to recruit patients faster. There are varied ethnicities in the country. The regulatory environment is also very agile. So, we saw from the 90-day window period, it has come to 45-day window period. Another important aspect which I forgot to mention was that the the ICMR is taking baby steps to ensure for the local clinical trials there is a single ethics review which happens, but this hasn't been applied to the global clinical trials yet. So this is a first positive step towards ensuring that our regulatory environment is agile. The global data is also very acceptable because we are FDA and EMA compliant and we have electronic database. Ultimately, this leads to 40 to 70% lower operational costs, as well as generating globally valid data. So thus, early inclusion of India in the upcoming clinical trials is not just a low cost shortcut, but it is a global competitive advantage. And with that, I would like to say that India is definitely now ready for prime time to be a part of these global clinical trials. That's all from my end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shweta, for walking us through the different developments that have happened in recent years, particularly with respect to regulations and the way the industry looks at doing clinical trials in India, and how quality as such has improved overall as far as global clinical trials with Indian data. So now we'll go on to some of the questions that are asked from the audience. Shweta, can you give your comment on what is the implication of implementing AI global protocol design, AI in global protocol design and operations management?
So, if I understand your question correctly, does it mean that how we can adapt a global protocol
Now,
leveraging AI in India?
yeah, so from what I understood, he wants probably your comments, Dr. Sambaji wants your comments on implementation of AI in global protocol design and operations management, how it is improving the whole process of doing clinical trials in India.
Got it. So, and thank you for that question. So, one important aspect in which from the pharma perspective, which we see is that although we leverage AI to streamline certain processes, right, from an operations, but there is a human touch point needed at all time points. So, even if we use a software which is an AI based software, but we also ensure that there is human intervention at each time point, because that becomes really important.
Thank you. And there is a question from Dr. Avi Kulkarni. How might we address concerns that the global pharma may have about quality and risks in doing a clinical trial in India, given the past experience that India has had?
Correct. So we have seen that, and like I said, mentioned in my presentation as well, that in the past, because our regulatory framework was not very structured, right? We did not have electronic databases. We did not have well-trained sites. Our site infrastructure was also not well developed. As a result, there were a lot of inconsistencies in the data, because of which global clinical trials were not able to recruit patients well, or they were not very happy with the way this happened. But now, because of all these aspects improvement, so there is an EMR system across every single hospital. Very few, probably very smaller hospitals would be having a handwritten electronic a handwritten medical record. Majority of the medical records are now into the electronic system. Then those high volume centers which are capable of doing trials, they have a well defined clinical research team sitting in their hospital as well, which is able to ensure that every protocol is followed to the nit. And last but not the least, the regulatory framework has also improved, right? So previously there were a lot of inconsistencies when it came to approval of any so if like I said, whenever a US FDA submission happens, parallelly we have a submission in India as well, because our framework is now very well defined. So that has really helped that. And this is from my experience, that if we receive a US FDA approval, let's say in January this year, in India we're receiving the approval right within 4 to 5 months. So one of our therapies had the fastest approval timeline, that is just 60 days after US FDA approval. So if you can you imagine the kind of pace at which India is also, getting that limelight. And because and again, another point to note is that because we had good number of patients in that trial as well, the trial was considered for an approval. Otherwise it would not have been considered for approval. So these are all the aspects which really helped.
Thank you, Shweta. So there's another question, another comment rather, about the unpredictability of regulatory approval timelines in India. So based on your recent experience, has there been improvement in the consistency
Yes.
and efficiency of approvals from Indian regulatory authorities of late?
Absolutely. So these are all, so like I said, in the past, because the patient numbers in India were very small, that's why the regulatory authorities were also quite skeptical of approving protocols or approving new molecules. But now, because we have the right, so whenever a GCT comes to India, there is and after the regulatory filing happens, when we present the protocol as well, there are multiple questions asked by the regulatory authorities. And if there need to be some justification which is given, there is an amendment made to the global clinical protocol as well, or these suggestions are passed on to our global team so that they are, made a part of the India protocol. The second most important aspect is because the regulatory framework has become very well defined, that they have laid those guidelines that, you need to have patient numbers. When would we consider it as a waiver? When it's a very rare disease, it's absolutely impossible to recruit patients in India, that's when they will consider. So these guidelines are very set, and that's why now no longer there are inconsistencies. In fact, with the burden of global clinical trials, so much so, in the past, every month there would be just one meeting which the CDSCO would conduct. But now we see they are conducting weekly meetings because there are so many protocols which are coming for review.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta, for that answer. So about coming back to the question about India participating in clinical trials, there's a lot of change in the global clinical trials when you talk about decentralized clinical trials, right? So how much is India geared up for actually participating in DCTs, especially because the regulatory authority has not even not had any regulations as of now towards DCT yet in India. So what is your opinion on that? Is there a workaround strategy for that? There's a question from the
Yeah.
audience for
So
that.
Yes. So actually, what we have also seen is that DCTs have just started coming up, right? And because the regulatory framework is also not very well defined, uh, that framework or those kind of clinical trials are only being conducted at a local level as of now. And from a global clinical standpoint, DCT is yet not considered. Right, but I think with the initiation and this regulatory framework getting better day by day, hopefully that will also see the light of day in India. But as of now, I do not see that DCTs are being taken up so proactively. But yeah, of course, if you have any experience from DCTs happening in India, please feel free to share your perspectives on it.
Yes. So I think decentralized clinical trials are increasingly being adapted in proportions. Maybe there is some part of the protocol which has a DCT element, but it's not a full-fledged decentralized clinical trial because obviously there are challenges to conducting some of the DCTs, some full-fledged decentralized clinical trial. And gradually we will see greater adaptation of decentralized clinical trials in India. So there is another question from Dr. Avi again. What is the best way to educate global pharma about all improvements in India as far as clinical trials are concerned, be it better EDCs or better EMRs or more stringent regulations, better trained personnel?
I
How
think
can we change the perception from from global pharma about India with respect
no.
to
So
each of these things?
So, like I said, right? So, whenever a global clinical trial is considered, they have certain mandatory requirements for ensuring that let's say, a set institute needs to have XYZ aspects very clear and well defined, right? But we've seen because this requirement has increased more and more, and at an India level, also, we are seeing that there is a complete transition of handwritten records to electronic data records. We are seeing that change happening for the site training as well. I mentioned previously that now our site infrastructure has improved. So any tier two, tier three city also now has a well-defined ecosystem as a part of their hospital. So they have a clinical research team or clinical research coordinator. They have the equipment, the lab setup, the storage facility, all what is needed for a clinical time. And I think um, even the medical research societies in our country are trying and ensuring that they uplift the capabilities more and more. So I think it's not just a one-way thing, it's a two-way thing happening, because of which global is really convinced that yes, India does have the infrastructure, and India is ready to ensure that we have all the processes in place, and that's why it's getting considered to be a part of the trials as well. So it's not just the
Yes.
patient numbers per se, but it's all these aspects along with it.
Yeah. Thank you, Shweta. There's one question on whether is it really mandatory. The question from Ajit, is it really mandatory for all companies across the globe that if they're conducting a phase 3 trial, should they really recruit patients from India?
So it's not a mandate from the global counterpart, but it's a mandate from the Indian counterpart. So let's say if there is a new drug which is being built by or developed by the US, and if we want that drug to be available in India, then it is a mandate for the Indian regulatory to ensure that we have a phase 3 trial in India. Now, of course, if we have to conduct a phase 3 trial in India with that molecule, the amount or the budget requirement is really going to be high. Hence, it's much more feasible for the pharma company to consider India as a part of the center, as a part of the trial, so that they have patients from India. And hence, if they have patients from India, then the approval is also easy. So it's as easy as that, yeah.
Yeah. There are some exceptions in this also, right? When the drug is in a particular context where we are having a drug which is for some life-threatening diseases when there is no options currently available in the market, I think then there is a waiver given for doing
Yes,
clinical trials in
absolutely.
India if the data is coming from the US and
Yes.
European countries, I think.
This is very restricted only for rare diseases or orphan diseases where, the patient population is very small and it's very difficult to recruit patients. That's when it's considered as a waiver for phase 3.
Yeah.
But today we are seeing, and just last week, we I saw that despite of having 20 Indian patients into the global clinical trial, we were still asked to conduct a phase 4 study as a part of safety. So because the regulatory framework has become so strict.
Yes. Yes. So I think we are almost through with our questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Shweta, for enlightening all of us on the way global pharma looks at clinical trials, performing clinical trials in India. And we hope to see more clinical trials happening in the country, especially as that statistic that you mentioned in the beginning, that we almost have 17 to 20% of the world population, and our contribution is still barely 5%. So there is still a lot of work to be done, and India, I think, is going in the right direction. The
Yes.
budget that is presented this year clearly shows that. So I think we have better days ahead.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the active discussions. I was happy to answer your questions. But if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you so much, InoRx team, Dr. Melvin, for this opportunity. I hope this was a good session and there were some learnings.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shweta, and Dr. Shweta, for giving your valuable time. Have a pleasant evening, and thank you, everyone. I now hand over the time to Alisa.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much. We just wanted to wrap this up. And if there are any other questions that you have, please send them over to hello@inorx.com. We'll be happy to answer them there. But thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Shweta and Dr. Melvin, for your time. We really appreciate all the insights that were shared today. I hope you all have an amazing evening. And if you're just starting your day, have a great day as well.